Welcome to Writers on Writing. I'm your host, Dr. Brenda Greene, and Writers on Writing comes to you every Sunday and gives you, our listening audience, an opportunity to hear writers from the African diaspora talk about their work, their lives, and their craft. This radio broadcast from Medgar Evers College is paid for by Medgar Evers College. And I am so pleased to have with me today in virtual space the famous, the legendary, the prolific Dr. Mary Helen Washington. Welcome, Dr. Washington.
Thank you, Brenda. And you must call me Mary Helen.
I will, and you can call me Brenda. Okay, so let's share with our listening audience some bit of biographical information about you. Mary Helen Washington is an accomplished African-American literary scholar and the author of numerous books on the African-American female experience. She is best known for her influence on increasing representation of Black authors in education and in literary schools of thought. Her works include Midnight Birds, stories by contemporary Black women writers, Black-Eyed Susan's Midnight Birds. That's when you added you did an update. The Other Black Lists, the African-American literary and cultural left of the 1950s. Invented Lives, narratives of Black women, 1860 to 1960. Memory of Kin, stories about family by Black writers. The foreword for Their Eyes Were Watching God. And of course, you are currently working on the biography of Paule Marshall. And your work integrates ideas of feminism and communism according to the Black female experience. So welcome. We're going to talk a little bit about you, your work, and what you're doing with Paule Marshall. We were so excited to have you as a keynote participant in the Symposium on Paule Marshall and John A. Williams. You added so much. And I had not really seen or heard you, and you probably don't remember me, since the last National Black Writers Conference many, many years ago when I first met you. And of course, remember using the book Invented Lives. So it's such a pleasure and an honor and a privilege to be in conversation with you.
I feel, Brenda, as though the honor and the privilege is all mine. After watching the way you put together that National Black Literary Conference, I am in awe of the people who continue to maintain support for African-American literature and culture and hold on even when the times are lean and we have to be in virtual space.
Well, I think it was inspirational to me, and the quality of the programming and the talks. I learned so much, and it was interesting to hear you say you also were able to look at other ways you can shape the work you're doing with Paule Marshall. But before we go into that, I want to hear your story, how you came into studying the work of Black female writers. I read where you initially were motivated to find a passion. Why don't you share your story or how you came to be in this place you are?
Well, I like to say that I came in off the streets because I was part of the early Black Studies movement back somewhere between 1968 and 1972. And you may know that the way we got Black Studies programs was through protests and rallies and sit-ins and all that kind of protests that helped to produce African-American studies. And it's very clear that without those Black studies programs proliferating all over the country, we would not have the attention to Black literature and Black culture and Black history that we have now. There's a direct connection between what goes on in the universities and colleges and high schools too, and how much attention is paid to Black literary culture. So I came out the streets. I started a Black Studies program at the University of Detroit. And Detroit in those days was a hotbed of protest and activism. We started this program with just three faculty members. And between 68, I think, and 75, those Black Studies programs proliferated all over the country. And I have to say that the reason, the motivating factor for my passion for this work came from those people who pushed me into protest movements and told me about Fanon and people who had Black bookstores. I'm thinking right now of Edward Vaughn, who had Vaughn's bookstore in Detroit, Michigan. It was a confluence of activism, community, and people in a collective. And, you know, we missed some of that, but that's what I got out of that National Black Literary Conference over the weekend, is that sense of when you have that collective, you have real power, you have real passion. And I would say my passion is always connected to those collectives and those organizations that help to shore up our culture and our literature.
Those were very exciting times. I was actually a student at New York University in 68. And I remember having these cultural programs that would start early in the evening and go all night with the poets and the musicians and the performance artists and the lecturers all coming together. And we had visiting professors at NYU who would come from Howard to teach at New York University. And that's around the time Medgar Evers College was formed. And what's beautiful about that, as you said, that spirit of collegiality and collectiveness and everyone coming together. And there's no boundaries between the literature and the art. The seeds of Black activism. And I think I see some of that in some of the young people today, people who are in their 20s. They're doing it in a slightly different way. But some of what we see in the Black Lives Movement, I think, is reflected there. One of the things you talk about, and just going back into your work, you talked about how you came into that. How did you come to study and focus on Black women, and why Black women writers?
And that's another moment that I can actually pinpoint, because I was teaching Black literature at the University of Detroit, and most of the books were books by Black men. And I started looking for work by Black women, and I couldn't find anything in actual published form, or they would be chapters or stories in other books. And I was at the Xeroxing machine all the time, Xeroxing these stories. In fact, I remember one of the first stories that I copied on that Xerox machine was Alice Walker's short story, Everyday Use. And then I was, copying Gwendolyn Brooks' short stories and Alexis DeVos. And at one point I thought, all I do is Xerox these, this material. And so I happened to go to a conference and I met Marie Brown. Marie Brown and Toni Morrison were two of the only Black women editors, I think, in New York. And I told her what I was doing. And she said to me, and this again, it comes right out of that moment of activism in the 70s. She said, well, send me a proposal. So I took all these stories that I had been Xeroxing, sent them to her with an introduction and said, you should publish these stories. And she sent me a contract by return mail. And that's where Black Eyed Susans came from. And if you can believe this, when Black Eyed Susans came out in 1975, people had never heard of Toni Morrison. I mean, maybe Alice Walker, probably not. They certainly had never heard of Paule Marshall. And I put all of these stories in that collection. And it was introducing those women for the first time. And of course, there's a feminist movement, there's a gay and lesbian movement, and all of those things are beginning to make us aware of how many marginalities there are. It's not just that you're marginalized on the basis of race, but also on gender, also on sexuality, also on, geography. And so the excitement that came with those stories, I would pass, because, Black Eyed Susan's a little book, I don't know what it cost. It's probably 75 cents back then. I passed that out at the beauty shop. I mean, literally, I did what Langston Hughes did. I took my books in a bag in my car, took them around. I gave them to the woman who was my beautician at the time. She put them on the front counter. And when I went back, she said, "Oh, I hope you brought some more," because I sold all of those.
Oh, people were hungry for that.
Just hungry for it,
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
What did you look for when you were developing that anthology? What are the qualities you looked for in the stories?
I can tell you exactly what it was. I wanted to read stories that were not like the pictures that I had been given of Black women. I wanted to see women who did not fit any of those molds that we think of. I wanted to have, Alexis DeVoe has these wonderful stories where she introduces us to women who are lesbian. I wanted to have stories about women who were interested in different aspects of life, people who were in psychology. I wanted stories like Gwendolyn Brooks's stories. Gwendolyn Brooks's stories are so powerful, and they are all about a Black woman's interiority. What goes on inside of us, not these pictures that come from the outside and tell us who we are. So I wanted people, every time they read a story that was in my anthology, I wanted them to say, "I've never seen this depiction of Black women." Never.
Part of what you said, you talk about is the intersectionality of
Yes.
stories and writers being in conversations with one another. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what you saw among Black writers?
Well,
So you mentioned like Zora Neale Hurston and who Janie telling her story, and Rena telling her story.
And I take those as two examples. Their Eyes Were Watching God and Paule Marshall's Rena. Rena comes out first in 1962. It's way ahead of its time. And whenever Black women would tell a story, they would always include issues of race and issues of gender and issues of the community. They would talk about their mothers, their fathers, their, other relatives, the way they fit into a community, and almost always the way they didn't fit into a community. That communities were dominated in ways that they had to move away from. That was like a new story for me, because I had been taught, oh, these are stories about community. Black people write stories about community. Well, Black women write stories about the problems in community. So that's the kind of intersectionality. It's not just race and gender. It's also, idiosyncratic views about life and about the world. John O'Killens, this is interesting because I know he was one of the people who began the National Black Writers.
Yes.
When Alice Childress is one of the writers in one of my books, and so is Paule Marshall. And John Killens called both of them to task for writing stories about interracial relationships between Black women and white men. He did not like that. In fact, he said very specifically about Alice Childress when she did her play Wedding Band, he said it was a betrayal of the race. Well, Black women wrote about all of those things that men thought were betrayals.
Right. And men could write about interracial, but
men could write about those interracial stories, yes, with no problem. But when a woman wrote about it, it became you're betraying the men of the race. So, these women writers also did a lot of excavation of what those heterosexual relationships were like too.
And think about Richard Wright and Zora Neale Hurston.
Yes, at odds with each other, because he didn't like the way she portrayed men, but he also didn't like the way she portrayed the whole community. He wanted a community that was much more serious and, to the task of, taking care of the race. And she has a community that's full of laughter and full of people, doing shenanigans. But that was the community that she knew. And here's another way in which women were idiosyncratic. She's in a community in Eatonville, Florida, that is an all-Black town founded by Black people, in which you have the full range of Black humanity there. No one did that before 1937.
And who knew about those towns?
Yeah.
Those all Black towns.
Who knew that they were the material for literature?
Yes.
You know, some historians wrote about it, but Hurston gives us that as a literary subject.
And what you're saying, she's reaching everyone. Those stories are reaching everyone. So if we can pivot and go to Paule Marshall, what drew you to Paule Marshall and to really zero in on her stories?
Actually, absolutely the same thing. I picked up Brown Girl Brownstones. I have multiple copies here, but I picked up Brown Girl Brownstones and had this beautiful kind of longing picture of a Black girl with a kind of, longing on her face. And of course I couldn't put it down. And one of the reasons I loved it is this young girl has the potential, the creative potential, the interiority, the strength to come of age in a way that allows her to mature and blossom. And let me just tell you one incident in this novel that really drew me to her. She has an affair when she's about 19 with an older man. And she has this affair when she's in college. Now, usually, as soon as a young Black girl starts having sex, we expect a negative ending. This is not going to turn out well. Well, not only does it turn out well, but it turns out that this affair, which she's hiding from her parents, allows her to get good grades in school. She becomes a star dancer in the dance troupe at school. And the novel describes her in this moment in her life as exhilarated, as excited and, full of life. That's a very different story. The story you come to expect is the story of she was seduced and abandoned. She had a child out of wedlock. Her life, went down from there. Well, her life just goes right on up.
It's different. One of the things you write about in Praise Song for the Widow, I think, we just read that in our book club, and how she's telling the story of a middle-aged or upper middle-aged woman. Yes. That's also very different.
Also very different. And she said that she wrote that novel as a way of entering into middle age herself. She wanted to kind of examine what is it like in a kind of creative way. How can I understand middle age? And what you find out again is that there's still this rich interior life going on, and a kind of learning a new exhilaration about life. Is not about coming to the end of anything. And it's definitely not about finding a man. It's about finding herself. And so she sets out on this journey. She doesn't even know she's going to go on this journey. She thinks she's going to go on a cruise ship. And instead she ends up on this kind of dilapidated boat on her way to Carriacou, where she connects with this community in Carriacou who have kept alive memories of Africa. And so there's all these new connections that she's making. And that's what I see in that novel. I see this is a novel about a middle-aged woman making new connections.
Making new connections, and it's international, going, the importance of spirituality in your life, yes. The importance of memories, the importance of cultural heritage is just so packed with so much.
All of that, yes.
Yeah, one of the things that I realized, you talk about Paule Marshall being radical. Mm-hmm. I never thought about her as a radical. Can you talk more, or in her activism, can you talk about that?
As I'm writing this biography, which I'm calling Paul Like a Man, and I'm calling it that because Paul, who was actually born Pauline Valencia Burke, changed her name from Pauline to Paul. And it was very hard to get people to pronounce it Paul. They always wanted to call it Paulie or Paula. And she said, no, it's Paul Like a Man. And that's what I'm calling this biography, is Paul Like a Man. So that gives you some inkling of the radical spirit in Paule Marshall's life. She did not want to be identified. She was trying to get a job in journalism, and she thought it would be easier if her name didn't sound, it didn't have a feminine sound to it. But it was also her claiming a space that men often are accorded. The other way, so in this biography, I go back to her early days at Hunter College, where she joined a left-wing group there called American Youth for Democracy that was close to the Communist Party. She was in other organizations that were radical, Association of Negro Artists for Freedom. All of them were, these organizations were pushing against the ways in which Blacks were exploited or discriminated against. And in those days, in the 1950s, that could get you in a lot of trouble. And indeed, she did get her own FBI file. So even just recognizing that whatever activity she was involved in, put her under the surveillance of the FBI tells you something about her radical proclivities. And then I think I see the radicalism in her work. People do not talk about the fact that all the way through Brown Girl, Brownstones, this young girl, a developing intellectual, constantly critiques capitalism. And she's always saying to her mother, why do you have this greed about money and about houses? And you're misusing and exploiting the rumors that we have here. And she's constantly saying that. And then I think, this is my final point about a kind of radicalism. This novel comes out in 1959. That's the heart of the integration movement. That's the moment in which we are supposed to be trying to become integrated. Right. And if you take a play like Raisin in the Sun, it's about that family moving towards an integrated place to live. Paule does not do integration. She moves her character not into an integrated national role. She moves her character out of the country. So Selena, at the end of Brown Girl, Brownstone, says she's got to go someplace else to see if she can find a way that people can live that don't exploit other people the way she sees in the United States.
So it's also a critique also a critique in a way on colonialism, isn't it? Also,
absolutely. And then each subsequent books that she writes, novels and short stories, all are set in a colonial setting where she is examining the colonial exploitation. She never lets you forget the Middle Passage. She never lets you forget that crossing of the Atlantic and what happened in it and how it has affected all Black people all over the world. So yes, she's radical.
Yes. And I hadn't thought about it. It got me thinking about it in a different way. Mm-hmm. What have been the highlights for you in writing this biography so far?
I'm still pretty much at the beginning. I've been working on it for a year, which means pretty much at the beginning. Yes. I think the highlights for me yes, I know what it was. I found a journal that she kept in China in 1983. It's a little green leather bound journal that she must have bought in China because it's very beautiful and it's got Chinese writing all over it. The reason this was such a highlight is that Paule does not talk about her personal life anywhere. I mean, all her interviewers would tell me you couldn't get Paule to talk about her personal life, but she does in this journal. And I'll tell you, my heart just started beating fast when I saw this journal, and it was in her storage space. So her son had given me the keys to the storage space. I think we both were there, and we're just going through boxes, and I'm not seeing anything really good. And then all of a sudden, in this one box, there's this little green journal with her writing in it from beginning to end. So that was exciting.
You have to be very selective in what you share from that journal. Mm-hmm. And what have been the challenges so far in writing?
Well, in 2019, when Paule died, she was 90. She had dementia, so I hadn't been able to interview her for about 8 years. And so many of the people who knew her have died. That's the hardest part. So it's hard to find people who knew her, like when she was a youngster, when she was a teenager, as a young woman. I haven't been able to find anybody who can talk about that part of her life. So that's the challenge.
That goes back to why we have to make sure that we're documenting everything we do. What can we do? Because we position this as an unsung hero. You know, I was just amazed at how so many people really didn't know her, and people not only the general public, but my contemporaries, people who are, you know, with degrees, people who are even teaching English, who really didn't know about her or John Williams. So what can we do to really change that? And the one question I have, and I'll let you answer that first, but then I'm going to ask you another related question on that. What do you think we can do?
You know,
and why did she remain unsung? That's kind of the core.
That's a very good question. And part of the reason for that is Paule's work, to me, was always published 10 years too early. So Brown Girl Brownstones comes out in 1959. Imagine if that novel had come out in 1979, we would all know Paule's name. But it came out early, before any feminist movement. And the feminist movement, like Black Studies, also helps to keep alive literature. And then I think the second thing is this biography will go a long way to making her a better known writer. Because that's what happens when the biography comes out and you have this life you can hang on to and tidbits about what they did and where they went and who they saw and who they slept with. All of those things help you to be interested in the writer. And so that's one of the goals I have for this book, is to make her better known.
I hope that happens. Can you cite any other younger scholars who are carrying forth your legacy? I mean, it's part of what I grapple with, and I think, you know, many people who are where we are, who's coming behind us and who's going to continue that work? Can you share with us any people you know who are doing that work and who we need to look forward to or look at?
Well, all of my students are doing that work. I mean, I've trained students now over 30 years. And so, you know, Sean Myers and Shirley Moody Turner and Israel Augustus Durham and Chad Infante. I mean, I could go on with all the names of the students that I've had over the years. Roberta McGuire, Ann Carroll, you know, Christopher Brown. I mean, all of these people are doing this work. You know, it is one of the things that is maybe not as well known as it should be, is how many Black graduate students are coming out of universities and colleges, and they studied under African-American professors. And so they know the work, and in many cases, it's become the work that they've chosen. They've become Americanists. So there's a lot of them out there. I can't keep up with their work.
That's beautiful to know. So if you had to, as we come to a close, if you had to brainstorm a canon, you talk about we have to bust the canon. You had to brainstorm a canon or a course on Black writers. Who are some of the people you would include or must read? First course, they don't know anything about Black female writers. Who should we include?
Well, I would start with Brown Girl Brownstones and Paule Marshall. And I would definitely start somewhere early with Alexis DeVoe. I think Alexis DeVoe's short stories are absolutely brilliant. I would have Octavia Butler. I would certainly have Andrea Lee. Andrea Lee just published a new book called Red Island House. I'd have her first book in there, Sarah Phillips. I'd have Zammy by Audre Lorde. And without a doubt, I would have Gwendolyn Brooks's novel Maud Martha and her poetry. mean, that is one of the real unsung heroes is Gwendolyn Brooks.
And she's a poet laureate, yes.
Yeah.
Think about what was done to her.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, Paule Marshall cites Gwendolyn Brooks over and over again as the writer who most influenced her, and Maud Martha as the book that was the most influential on her writing. So, if I could talk to the writers who are doing novels and, other forms of creative writing, I would say it would be wonderful if they would names of other writers, not just their own names, but other writers, the way James Baldwin talked about Richard Wright. I mean, he talked about him, in negative terms, but he talked about him. And he talked about Ralph Ellison, and Ralph Ellison talked about James Baldwin. And that's the way they circulated those male names. I wish that women writers would circulate the names of people that have influenced them or that they read, so that, they keep alive this kind of virtual collective of Black writers, men and women.
Thank you so much. That is a great way to close. Keep the names, circulate the names.
Yes, say their names.
Say their names. And we have been I've been having a conversation with Mary Helen Washington, an outstanding scholar, a keeper of the words, a literary activist in a way, and someone who's making sure that women's voices are heard. And you have been listening to Writers on Writing. Remember, the writer is always reading, the reader is always writing. Keep reading and writing. Empower yourselves as readers and writers. And this broadcast of Medgar Evers College is paid for by Medgar Evers College. Thank you for a wonderful conversation, Mary Helen, and I'm looking so forward to reading Paule's book.
Thank you very much.
Your biography by Paule.
Thank you. Thanks, Brenda.
You're welcome.